Hello and welcome to Christ Church of Fort Thomas, Kentucky. My name is Edward Good and I'm pastor of this congregation. We are affiliated in covenant relationship with the United Church of Christ, and our guiding statement is that we embrace all as we journey the way of Jesus. And so we're seeking to live into that of what it means to embrace all and what it means to journey the way of Jesus. We're all still a work in progress. So we're grateful that you're with us as you're a work in progress as well, wherever you are in your life journey or your faith journey. Just a couple things in the life of the church. First of all, I just want to remind you that this is the last of our things will be online for the next 3 Sundays. I will be out of town for about the next 2.5 weeks or so. And so we will resume these in early April. So just a heads up for you on that. One of the Sundays that I am gone is March 30th. And we will be doing a really unique thing in the life of the church here. We're going to be doing what's called Be the Church Sunday, where we will have a short service in person at 9:30 in partnership with our friends at First Presbyterian Church. And then when that's done, about 9:45, we are going to go off to a series of different opportunities to serve and to share. And so one of them is going to be doing a hymn sing at a nursing home. One will be making pancakes and a brunch for veterans at the VA hospital here in Fort Thomas. And the third will be packing up hygiene kits and blessing bags here at the church. And so if you are in the area, definitely come and be a part of that. You can sign up through the link on the church website. And so please be a part of that. We really would appreciate it. Related to that, for the blessing bags, we are collecting things like beef jerky and tuna and cracker packages and fruit cups and socks and things of that sort. So if you want to donate some of those things for those blessing bags, we would greatly appreciate it. Last thing is just a reminder that if you are a member of the church, you should have received a copy of the exploratory survey from our open and affirming discernment team and describing what that is and so forth. If you could please return that to the church as soon as possible. We did extend the deadline to March 17th, so you have another week or so, but the sooner you get them in, the easier it will be to compile all the results and look of where we're going to go as we discern that important decision in the life of the church. So again, wherever you are in your life journey or your faith journey, welcome. We are grateful that you are here. So we are continuing this series on boldness here on this first Sunday of the season of Lent. And today we are looking at a story about the prophet Elijah from the book of 1 Kings. And so first, though, let us pray. Lord, grant to your servant to speak your word with all boldness, and grant to all of us to speak and to live your word with all boldness, while you stretch out your hand to heal, and signs and wonders are performed through the name of your holy servant, Jesus. Amen. So our story today, it's a lengthy bit of a read, and so what you'll see on the screen during this, there's some images of mountaintops, because this is where this takes place, and just to kind of give a little bit of things instead of just you looking at me reading as well. So the passage comes from 1 Kings chapter 18, beginning in verse 20. So Ahab sent all the Israelites and assembled the prophets at Mount Carmel. Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you go limping with 2 different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." The people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said, "I, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets number 450. Let 2 bowls be given to us. Let them choose 1 bowl for themselves, cut it in pieces and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. I will prepare the other bowl and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire is indeed God." And all the people answered, "Well spoken." Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose for yourselves 1 bowl and prepare it first, for you are many. And then call on the name of your God, but put no fire to it." So they took the bowl that was given them, prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, crying, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice and no answer. They limped around the altar they had made. And at noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry aloud. Surely he's a god. Either he's meditating, or he's wandered away, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and must be awakened." They cried aloud, as was their custom. They cut themselves with swords and lances until the blood gushed out over them. As midday passed, they raved on until the offering of the oblation, but there was no voice, no answer, and no response. Then Elijah said to the people, "Come closer to me." And all the people came closer. And first Elijah repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, "Israel shall be your name." With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and then he made a trench around it, large enough to contain 2 measures of seed. And then he put the wood in order, cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 jars with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." And then he said, "Do it a second time." And they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time. So that the water ran all around the altar and filled the trench also with the water. At the time of the offering of the oblation, the prophet Elijah came near and said, "O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your bidding. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you've turned their hearts back." And then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and even licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord indeed is God." And Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape." Then they seized them. And Elijah brought them down to the Wadi Kishon and slaughtered them there. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. As a science fiction nerd, I've always loved the idea of a time machine. The idea of a time machine goes all the way back, maybe even further back, but goes back for sure to H.G. Wells' book in 1895 called The Time Machine. And in the 100+ years since, there have been countless books and comics and movies and television shows about time machines. Even there's a musical about one. In fact, this musical, it's based on the movie Back to the Future. It's coming to Cincinnati later this year. So I've always loved the idea of being able to go back in time, but I doubt it will ever become a reality. And honestly, I don't know that I ever want it to become a reality. But there are some things in our lives that can do that a little bit for us. This Bible is one of those. This is the Bible that I used for the majority of my early years of trying to intentionally follow the way of Jesus in my life, going back to October of 1990, almost 35 years ago. Throughout this Bible are tons of notes and circles and highlights and underlines from different messages that I heard or Bible studies that I was a part of. There's one in Numbers that when I see it, it takes me back to a service that I attended in the middle school auditorium in one of the schools in Boulder. Another in the Gospel of Mark takes me back to a retreat that I was on during my sophomore year in college. And other notes bring me back to the cabins that I stayed in, cut out of the jungles of southern Belize in summers of 1993 and 1996. And still another is something that I found in here from our passage for today, from 1 Kings chapter 18. At some point in those years, I highlighted and underlined the last verse of our reading today. Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape. And they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the Wadi Kishon and slaughtered them there. Now, I don't have any notes written next to it, so I don't know why I highlighted those, but thinking back to the Ed that I was at the time, I have a pretty good idea. You see, at the time, I was steeped in kind of this hyper-masculine evangelical Christianity of the early 1990s. And I remember conversations that me and my buddies in our Bible studies, we'd have about Jesus. We'd view Jesus as like this total tough guy, right? It wasn't for us about the forgiving side of Jesus, the welcoming side of Jesus, as much as it was like Jesus was a tough guy. You do not mess with Jesus. Most of us had these t-shirts. You see an image of it on the screen right now. These Lord's Gym t-shirts that show this just totally ripped and buff Jesus lifting up this cross that Jesus carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. We had that kind of mentality about God and about Jesus, about our faith. And so I'm sure that when we read this passage from 1 Kings 18, we looked at this and was like, Elijah's a tough guy. Elijah's a guy you don't want to mess with. There's a word I would use, but it's in a sermon, so I'm not going to use it here. But you might know what I'm talking about. And so the way that I would have read this story is something like this. I would have seen Elijah as like this massive underdog, the 16 seed versus the 1 seed. One guy against these 450 prophets of Baal. And so they start this competition. Whose God is real? Whose God is better? Whose God is more powerful? And so Elijah wins the toss. He elects to defer. And so the prophets start. And from morning until late in the day, they're doing their thing. They're shouting, they're screaming, they're yelling for their God to come down and burn up this offering. And at midday, as they start to go even further, they start cutting themselves and stabbing themselves, and they're bleeding out onto the ground. Elijah, I imagine him kind of standing there with sort of like this look on his face, like, jeez. Kind of this disdainful look, this dehumanizing look. And he's talking trash to them. Hey, is your God resting? Hey, is your God go out for a bite to eat? Is your God, busy with something else? Is he going to the bathroom type of stuff? If this was modern day, Elijah would be sitting there with his phone, recording it and live streaming it and trolling these prophets of the ridiculousness of what he was seeing. And then when they were all done and exhausted, Elijah steps in. And on his own, we see this one guy. Imagine maybe that he would take off his outer robe and got these bulging biceps, and he picks up one stone after the other and starts setting up these stones to rebuild the altar of the Lord. Each one of these stones representing one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then he gets that final big slab of rock and sets it up on top. And then he takes the bull literally by the horns all by himself, and he slaughters that bull and he cuts it up to be that offering on top of the altar. And then he calls the people and says, pour all this water over it. Again, even that action is kind of trolling these Baal prophets. And then he calls upon God all by himself for God to come down and burn up this offering. And sure enough, God does. Burns it all up, even the dust around there. And I imagine that Elijah stands there, says, that was God at work. Mic drop. But he's not done. He sees the people respond to the story, remembering who they were, and they begin to worship God and recognizing that they need to follow the God of their ancestors. And then Elijah calls upon them to seize those 450 prophets of Baal, to seize them and to drag them down the mountain. And there we read that Elijah himself slaughters all 450 of them. That is the part that I highlighted and underlined. My guess is that I probably had this idea of like, you know what? Those heretics, those pagans got what they deserved. Elijah's actions were bold, absolutely. But when I read them now, I don't see the way of Jesus in his actions. I read it and I go, what the heck was Elijah thinking? And I also think, what was I thinking in celebrating that? Because what you've got here is an example of the cycle of violence and coercive power that is a part of human history. We see it over and over again in the past. We see it taking place in the present right now. Where once you've been wronged, you're going to go and fight back. You're going to get revenge. What would happen with those families of those 450 prophets of Baal? They're going to hear about what happened. And when the opportunity comes around, they're going to take revenge. And then revenge will be taken on them, and the cycle is just going to keep going over and over and over again. The cycle of coercive power never stops. It just gets worse. And that cycle is not the way of Jesus. The way of Jesus had plenty of opportunities to take up arms, to raise an army, to take revenge on the Romans and take revenge on the religious leaders that were oppressing the people. But every time an opportunity arose like that, Jesus stepped away. Nope, that's not what I do. And the one time that one of his followers resorted to violence to protect Jesus, Jesus rebuked Peter and healed the man that Peter wounded. Jesus was not about coercive power. He was about transforming power. And so with that in mind, let's think of this story of Elijah in a different way and think of a different form of boldness that we could have seen. So the setup is the same. Drought, Elijah hated by King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, competition on top of the mountain, 450 prophets of Baal dancing, singing, mutilating themselves, all of it the same. But instead of Elijah talking trash to them, instead of, Elijah talking trash to them, Elijah's standing there. And I imagine, in this case, he's just got a look of just like sadness on his face. Just pity on his face. Maybe even love on his face. He's not dehumanizing them. He's not tearing them down. But trying to love them. And to hire something different for them. And then when they were exhausted, this time Elijah steps up and first he calls to the people to come around them. And before he starts rebuilding the altar, he tells a story. He reminds the people of who they are. He reminds them of how they were each created in the image of God. And even those Baal prophets were created in the image of God. He reminds them about their father Abraham and their mother Sarah. He reminds them of the patriarchs who had laid the course of faith for them, Isaac and Jacob. He reminds them of their story about how their ancestors, and they themselves, in a sense, had been enslaved in Egypt. And when they had cried out to God, God heard them and set them free and brought them into the freedom of the promised land. He reminds them of the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And then as he tells this story, he invites someone from the tribe of Benjamin, for example, to come up and help him move that first stone into place. And then he asks for someone from the tribe of Naphtali, and maybe a couple of people get up and they move that stone. And he keeps going through all 12 tribes, and each time more people come to help move this stone of their tribe in place. And then a whole bunch of people at the end lift this big slab of stone to put it on top. And then all of them prepare the bowl for the offering. All of them prepare the sacrifice. All of them pour the water on, just as Elijah had done in the original story. And then they all together call upon God, and God rains down fire and burns up the offering, just as we read about. And when that fire falls down, what is left is a deep, awe-filled silence. But the silence is then broken. As each one of those 450 bleeding, wounded prophets of Baal slowly make their way over to that altar, and they bow down to worship Yahweh. And then Elijah, rather than calling for them to be dragged down the mountain and slaughtered, Elijah calls upon the people to help those 450 up, to bind up their wounds, to clean up those wounds, and they are brought into the community. What could have ended in slaughter and continuing a cycle of revenge instead ends in redemption and community. That would have been a pretty bold step, wouldn't it? Now we hear that story and we think, gosh, that's a fairy tale. We know what we see in human history time and again. We see that cycle over and over and over again. And I'll be honest, I don't think it's all that bold to respond with violence, to respond with retribution. I think the boldness is to say, I'm going to chart a different course, a new way. That was the way when we read about the actions and the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King, and the nonviolent resistance movement for civil rights. King wasn't just about trying to get laws changed. Yes, he wanted laws changed, absolutely. But first and foremost, he wanted people's hearts to be changed. He didn't want things just to be legislated. He wanted people to make those choices for themselves to live a new way. King's goal was not to have victory over his opponents. His goal was to turn enemies into friends. You see that in his teachings, his writings, over and over again. And again, we look at that and say, yeah, okay, that's one example, but there are many, many others. And I want to tell you about one more. Summer of 2015, my family and I spent a month in South Africa. And one of the things that we did there was we visited Robben Island, the prison where off the coast of Cape Town, where Nelson Mandela had been held for over 25 years before being released and eventually becoming the president of the new South Africa. On our tour there, which was guided by a former prisoner who knew Mandela, we were being driven around the island and we came to the rock quarry, the limestone rock quarry, where Mandela and the other prisoners were forced to work day in and day out. The conditions in that quarry were brutal. The prisoners weren't given eye protection or face protection or anything like that, and especially on bright days, the stones were so bright it actually literally damaged the people's eyes. A couple years after Mandela became president, he held an event at Robben Island where he invited all the other surviving former prisoners from Robben Island, as well as social justice activists from all over the world who had been imprisoned and oppressed. There's a huge crowd of people there. And Mandela shared there in that rock quarry, that place that represented the oppression and the brutality of a former regime. He shared about how he so often in that quarry wanted to pick up a stone, pick up a rock and attack his oppressors. And how even after he's been released, he still felt that same anger and desire for revenge. And what he shared, and this was all being shared by our guide, he was there, he saw this, that Mandela then went and picked up a rock from the quarry, it was on the ground there, and he held up that rock and said, this rock is that vengeance that I wanted to exact upon others. And he said, I am going to set that down today. I'm going to release that today. And so he walked out from under the tent where he was, out into the empty spot of that quarry, and he set that rock down and he came back. And he asked the people there to do the same. Now, according to the guide, our guide, Mandela was saying that more just sort of in a metaphorical sense. Let go of your own bitterness, let go of your own anger. But one person stood up, went and got a rock himself and put it down next to Mandela's. And then each and every person who was there did the exact same thing, to where eventually there is the pile that you see on the screen now. And shortly after that, the South African government passed a law that no one can remove a stone from that pile, because it represents a desire for a new way to move forward. Not the cycle of violence, not the cycle of revenge, but the cycle of redemption, community, of transformative power, not coercive power. So yes, Elijah's actions, as they were written in our passage, they were bold. But what if? What if he had taken another course that was even more bold and more unique, and it led to transformation and not destruction? So today I want to invite you, wherever you are, to find a rock somewhere. Maybe outside your home, maybe somewhere where you're walking, and hold on to that for a little while and think about the bitterness that you may hold in your life against someone, against something. And find a place to set down that rock. In our in-person service, I'm going to invite people to set them down outside or at the base of our peace pole outside our church. To set that down and say, I want to pursue a new way. So wherever you are, find some place to do the same. To let go of that and take a new, bold step forward in the way of Jesus. Grace, peace, love, and joy be with you today and every day. Amen.